The city was drowning in chaos. Cars sat abandoned in the streets, some still running, their doors flung open as if their drivers had vanished mid-drive. The air was thick with smoke, the distant glow of fires licking at the sky. Screams echoed from every direction, blending with the inhuman moans of the undead. Mason Carter gripped the tire iron in his hand, his knuckles white. He had just seen a woman get torn apart outside a convenience store, and he was still trying to process it. One moment she was running, screaming for help. The next, she was on the ground, blood pooling beneath her as the creatures tore into her flesh. He forced himself to move. Standing still meant death. As he sprinted down an alley, he nearly ran straight into another survivor, a young woman with a bloody baseball bat clutched in her hands. She recoiled, ready to swing. "Whoa! Easy!" Mason raised his hands, stepping back. The woman hesitated, then lowered the bat slightly. She had dark hair tied back, sweat and dirt smeared across her face. "You're not bitten?" "No," he said, catching his breath. "You?" She shook her head. "Name's Riley." Before Mason could respond, another figure appeared behind Riley, a man in a security guard uniform with a rifle slung over his shoulder. "Both of you, inside, now!" Mason turned. A group of infected had rounded the corner, their dead eyes locking onto fresh prey. Riley didn't hesitate, she grabbed Mason's arm and dragged him toward a nearby diner, where the security guard was already holding the door open. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The windows were covered with hastily nailed boards, allowing only slivers of the outside world to peek through. 4 other people were inside, a man in a business suit with a makeshift bandage around his arm, a teenage girl clutching a kitchen knife, an elderly woman with haunted eyes, and a muscular man gripping a crowbar like it was his lifeline. "Who the hell are they?" the suited man demanded, eyeing Mason and Riley. "More survivors, Greg," the security guard snapped. "The more of us there are, the better chance we got." Greg scoffed but said nothing. Riley surveyed the group. "Anyone got a plan? 'Cause if we stay here, we're screwed." The muscular man, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "There's a military evacuation point about 5 miles from here." Greg shook his head. "The military's gone. They were evacuating people this morning, but now? We're on our own." Silence fell over the group. Mason exhaled sharply. "Then we make our own way out." Riley nodded. "Agreed. But first, we need supplies. Weapons, food, anything we can carry." The security guard, whose name tag read Dawson, nodded. "There's a grocery store a few blocks away. It's risky, but it might be our best shot." Greg scoffed again. "Risky? It's suicide." Mason tightened his grip on the tire iron. "So staying here." Dawson checked his rifle. "We move fast, stick together, and we don't stop for anything." The group exchanged uneasy glances. They barely knew each other, but at this moment, survival meant working together. Outside, the moans of the undead grew louder. Their time was running out. The grocery store was supposed to be their salvation. Instead, it was a death trap. Mason crouched behind a checkout counter, his breathing shallow. Across the aisle, Riley pressed herself against a shelf, her fingers wrapped tightly around her bat. Dawson was near the entrance, his rifle raised. And Greg? He was the reason they were in this mess. "Are you insane?" Riley hissed, her voice barely above a whisper. Greg stood frozen in the middle of the store, a fallen display of canned goods scattered around him. The deafening crash had drawn the attention of the dead. The moans outside grew louder, followed by the sickening sound of shuffling feet. Mason clenched his jaw. "We need to move. Now." The teenage girl, Emily, gripped her knife, her eyes darting nervously. The older woman, Mrs. Castillo, muttered a prayer under her breath. The muscular man, Jay, flexed his grip on the crowbar. Dawson peeked through a crack in the boarded-up windows. They're coming. The first zombie reached the glass, its decayed fingers smearing blood against the surface. Others followed, pressing against the window until the wood creaked. Then, the glass shattered. "Run!" Dawson barked. The undead poured in like a wave. Mason yanked Emily's arm, dragging her toward the back of the store. Riley was already smashing a zombie's skull in, blood splattering her face. Jay swung his crowbar, caving in another skull with a sickening crunch. Greg, panicked, shoved past them, sprinting for the emergency exit. "Screw this. I'm out." "Greg, don't," Mason started, but it was too late. Greg kicked open the back door, triggering the store's alarm. A piercing siren wailed through the streets, attracting every zombie within earshot. "Oh, you idiot," Riley growled. The group had no choice but to follow. Mason and Dawson shoved the others through the door just as the store was completely overrun. Outside, the alley was crawling with infected. "We're surrounded," Emily cried. Dawson fired a shot, dropping one of the zombies, but the gunfire only drew more. Jay swung wildly, knocking one to the ground, but two more took its place. "Keep moving," Mason yelled. They pushed forward, their weapons the only thing keeping the undead at bay. Greg was already ahead, sprinting toward an abandoned delivery truck. Riley spotted it too. "That's our way out." Greg reached the truck first, yanking the door handle, locked. "No, no, no." He pounded on the window, desperate. Zombies closed in. Dawson fired another round, but he was running low on bullets. Jay and Riley fought viciously, but they were outnumbered. Mason saw it first, a fire escape leading to the roof of an apartment building. "Up there." He grabbed Emily and shoved her toward the ladder. Riley followed, then Mrs. Castillo. "Go, go, go." Dawson covered them, but the undead were closing in. Greg made a last-ditch effort to pry open the truck's door, too late. Rotten hands grabbed him, pulling him into the swarm. He screamed. Mason hesitated only for a second before climbing the ladder. The last thing he saw before reaching the rooftop was Greg's body disappearing beneath a mass of gnashing teeth. There was no saving him. As the group collapsed onto the rooftop, gasping for air, Riley broke the silence. "We can't keep running." Mason stared at the city skyline, fires burning in the distance. She was right. They needed a plan. The rooftop was eerily quiet compared to the chaos below. The city burned in the distance, thick plumes of smoke rising against the darkening sky. The streets were a sea of the undead, drawn to the wailing sirens and flickering flames. Mason ran a hand through his sweat-soaked hair, trying to catch his breath. "We can't stay here." "No kidding," Riley muttered, gripping her bat like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. Dawson checked his rifle. "We need to find somewhere safe for the night. We're running low on everything, ammo, food, even water." Mrs. Castillo wiped her forehead with trembling hands. "We can't keep running forever." Jay, still catching his breath, looked over the edge of the rooftop. "The fire escape connects to the next building. If we keep moving across the rooftops, we might avoid the worst of the hordes." Mason nodded. "All right. We move fast, stay quiet, and—" A metallic clatter cut him off. Everyone turned. Emily stood frozen, her knife on the ground. Her face was pale, her sleeve pushed up just enough to reveal a bite mark on her forearm. The world seemed to stop. "Oh, hell," Riley whispered. Emily yanked her sleeve down, shaking her head frantically. It's not what you think." "Not what we think?" Dawson's grip on his rifle tightened. "That's a goddamn bite." Mason stepped forward, keeping his voice calm. "Emily, when did this happen?" The girl's eyes darted to Mrs. Castillo, who looked away, guilt written all over her face. "She's had it since the grocery store," the older woman admitted. Riley's face twisted with fury. "And you didn't think to tell us?" Emily backed away, tears spilling down her cheeks. I didn't want to die. I thought maybe I'd be okay. Dawson sighed, his expression hardening. No one comes back from a bite. Jay stepped between them. She's just a kid. And that kid is a ticking time bomb, Riley snapped. We wait too long, she turns, and we all die. Silence. Then, Emily bolted. Emily, wait! Mason lunged, but she was already sprinting across the rooftop, heading for the fire escape. The others scrambled after her, but Emily was fast, her fear giving her strength. She hit the ladder and started climbing down into the alley. Straight into a group of zombies. No! Mason shouted. Emily hesitated for half a second before darting toward an open warehouse door. She disappeared inside. Mason swore under his breath. We have to go after her. Dawson hesitated. Mason. We don't leave people behind, he snapped. Riley exhaled sharply. Damn it. Fine. But if she turns. Mason didn't let her finish. He was already climbing down after Emily, the others reluctantly following. Inside the warehouse, it was dark, the only light filtering through shattered windows. The air was thick with dust and the faint stench of rot. Mason crept forward, his heart pounding. Emily? A muffled sob answered from the shadows. He found her curled up against a stack of crates, clutching her arm. I don't want to die, she whispered. Mason knelt beside her. We're not gonna let that happen. A low growl rumbled from the darkness. Mason's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. A guttural snarl echoed through the warehouse, sending a chill down Mason's spine. He barely had time to react before a shape lunged from the shadows. Move, he shouted, yanking Emily back just as a zombie crashed into the crates where she had been sitting. The creature was fresh, its face still recognizable as human, its eyes milky white, lips peeled back to reveal jagged teeth. It scrambled to its feet unnaturally fast, groaning as it reached for them. Not just one. More figures stirred in the darkness. Company's here. Dawson yelled, raising his rifle. The others had just made it inside, their weapons drawn. Riley swung her bat hard, smashing one of the infected in the side of the skull. It crumpled to the ground, but another took its place. Too many. Jay growled, swinging his crowbar at an approaching zombie. Mrs. Castillo clutched a wrench, her hands shaking. We have to get out of here. Mason grabbed Emily's arm, helping her to her feet. Exit? Back door. Dawson pointed toward a rusted metal door across the warehouse. Zombies blocked the way. No choice, Riley muttered. She charged, taking out one as Mason and Jay plowed through another. Dawson fired a shot, then another, click. Out of ammo. A zombie tackled him, knocking him to the ground. Its rotting hands clawed at his vest as it snapped its teeth inches from his face. Jay rushed forward and swung his crowbar, caving in the thing's skull. Dawson shoved it off, panting. I owe you one. They pushed forward. Emily stumbled, her face pale. The infection was spreading fast. Mason tightened his grip on her. Come on, stay with me. They reached the back door, but when Jay tried to push it open, it didn't budge. Locked. Of course it is, Riley muttered. Mason's mind raced. The zombies were closing in. The only way out was the loading dock. He pointed to the right, where an old truck was parked. Dawson ran over, checking the driver's side. Keys are still inside. Mason, Riley, and Jay formed a barrier, taking out as many zombies as they could while Dawson got the engine running. Vroom. The truck roared to life. Go! Go! Dawson shouted. Mason tossed Emily into the passenger seat as the others jumped onto the truck bed. Riley smashed a zombie's head against the metal frame just as Dawson floored it. The truck crashed through the warehouse doors, sending wood and debris flying. Zombies were flung aside as they barreled into the open streets. But they weren't safe yet. "We need to get out of the city," Riley shouted over the roar of the engine. "The bridge," Jay said. "It's the only way." Mason nodded. It was their best shot. But as they sped toward the outskirts, something caught his eye. A military helicopter hovering near the bridge. Salvation? Or a trap? Either way, they had no choice. They were running out of time. The truck roared down the ruined streets, swerving around abandoned cars and burning wreckage. The moans of the undead filled the air, their grotesque forms swarming the sidewalks and spilling into the roads. The group's destination loomed ahead, the bridge. Mason's grip tightened on the dashboard as Dawson pushed the truck's speed to its limit. "We need to make it before that helicopter leaves." From the truck bed, Riley slammed her bat against the roof. "Yeah? And what if they don't let us on?" No one had an answer. Emily groaned weakly from the passenger seat, her infected arm cradled against her chest. Her breathing was shallow, her skin ice-cold. She didn't have much time. Dawson swerved hard to avoid a wreck, sending the truck fishtailing. "Hold on." Ahead, the bridge was a battlefield. Military vehicles sat abandoned, some overturned, others still burning. The remnants of a failed evacuation were everywhere, bodies, both human and undead, scattered across the pavement. But the real threat was the horde. Hundreds of zombies clogged the bridge, drawn to the distant sound of the helicopter hovering near the other side. The aircraft spotlight swept across the carnage, the soldiers on board yelling instructions that were lost in the chaos. "There's no way through," Mrs. Castillo gasped. Mason scanned the scene. "We make one." Jay tightened his grip on his crowbar. "You're insane." "Not insane," Mason said. "Desperate." Dawson floored it. The truck plowed into the horde, crushing the first wave beneath its tires. Bodies slammed against the hood, rolling off as the vehicle lurched forward. The engine whined, struggling under the weight of so many corpses. "We're gonna get stuck," Riley shouted. Mason grabbed the rifle from Dawson's lap, kicked open the passenger door, and climbed onto the hood. "Cover me." He fired into the crowd, picking off the closest zombies as the others swung weapons from the truck bed. Blood sprayed across the windshield, but the path started to clear. Until the road gave out. The middle section of the bridge had collapsed, leaving a massive gap. The helicopter hovered just beyond it, but the drop was at least 20 feet. No, Dawson slammed the brakes. The truck skidded sideways, slamming into the bridge railing. The impact sent Mason flying. He hit the pavement hard, the rifle skidding out of reach. Dazed, he barely had time to register the swarm closing in. Then, boom! A deafening explosion ripped through the air as Dawson threw a grenade from the truck bed, blowing a hole through the undead ranks. Jay and Riley leapt down, hacking and smashing their way to Mason. They pulled him up just as the horde recovered, surging forward. The helicopter's spotlight locked onto them. A soldier waved frantically. "You need to jump." Mason looked at the gap. The only way across was a crumbling section of the bridge's support beams. "We have to climb," he said. Dawson grabbed Emily, hoisting her onto his back. "Then let's move." One by one, they scrambled onto the beams, carefully making their way across. Below them, the river churned with the bodies of the dead. Riley slipped, Mason caught her wrist just in time. "We're almost there," Jay called. The helicopter lowered a rope ladder. Soldiers reached down, pulling Jay, Riley, and Mrs. Castillo inside. Mason turned back. Dawson was struggling. Emily was barely conscious. He tried to lift her, but the infection had weakened her too much. Then the zombies reached them. Dawson's eyes met Mason's. "No," Mason breathed. Dawson shoved Emily toward him, forcing her into his arms. "Get her out." Then he turned and ran straight into the horde, guns blazing. Mason didn't have time to scream. He threw Emily onto the ladder and climbed after her. The last thing he saw before the helicopter lifted off was Dawson disappearing beneath a wave of undead. The city shrank below them, the ruined bridge vanishing into the darkness. They had escaped. But at what cost? The helicopter soared over the ruined city, the fires below painting the sky in eerie shades of orange and red. Inside the cabin, the survivors sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they had lost pressing down on them like a crushing force. Mason gripped the metal railing, his knuckles white. Dawson was gone. He had sacrificed himself so they could escape. The image of him disappearing beneath the horde played over and over in Mason's mind. Jay exhaled sharply, staring out at the city. He didn't have to do that. Yes, he did, Riley murmured, voice hollow. It was the only way. Mrs. Castillo wiped away silent tears, clutching a rosary she had pulled from her pocket. Dios lo tenga en su gloria. Mason forced himself to push the pain aside. They had made it out. They were alive. But Emily. He turned toward her. She was slumped against the seat, her skin even paler than before, her breathing ragged. The infection had spread fast. Sweat dripped down her forehead, and when she opened her eyes, they were glassy, distant. A soldier knelt beside her, checking her pulse. He looked up at Mason and shook his head. She doesn't have long. No, Mason whispered. There has to be something you can do. The soldier hesitated, then glanced toward the cockpit. We're taking you to a quarantine zone. A research facility. They've been working on something. If we can get her there in time. Mason barely heard the rest. His heart pounded. A cure? Where is it? Riley asked. About an hour north, the soldier replied. But, he glanced at Emily again. She might not make it that long. Emily stirred, her weak voice barely above a whisper. Mason. I'm scared. Mason swallowed hard. He took her hand, squeezing it gently. I know, kid. But you're gonna hold on, all right? You made it this far. She tried to smile, but it faded quickly. I don't want to turn. A heavy silence fell over the group. Mason looked at Riley, Jay, Mrs. Castillo. No one spoke, but the unspoken question hung in the air. If Emily didn't make it to the facility in time, would they let her turn? The soldier shifted uncomfortably. If she starts to change before we land, we'll have to. No, Mason snapped, cutting him off. She's not dying like that. Emily closed her eyes, her breathing shallow. The helicopter flew on, the research facility drawing closer with every second. But would it be soon enough? Would they finally find hope? Or was this just another false promise in a dying world? As the city burned behind them, Mason knew one thing for certain. No matter what happened next, he wasn't going to lose anyone else.